The life and death of Edward II is not just a medieval tragedy, it's a mirror reflecting what happens when love, vulnerability, and difference collide with a world built on power, control, and fear. He was a king born into a role he never quite fit, a man whose deepest affections were weaponized against him, a ruler undone not only by political enemies, but by a society unwilling to accept anything outside its rigid norms. And in his brutal end, we are reminded of the darkest parts of human history, how cruelty is often cloaked in justice, how pain becomes a message, and how power can silence even the highest born. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this: strength is not always found in the sword or in conquest. Sometimes it lies in the quiet defiance of being yourself in a world that demands you be something else. Edward II may have fallen, but his story endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a timeless warning that intolerance, fear, and the lust for power can destroy even kings, and that the price of being different can echo through centuries. History doesn't forget the broken. Sometimes it remembers them best. In the cold silence of Berkeley Castle behind walls meant to guard kings rather than bury them, a tragic story unfolded that still haunts the pages of history. Edward II, once crowned with glory and bound for greatness, died not as a monarch, but as a man stripped of everything titled dignity, even his humanity. He had been born into the most powerful royal family in Europe, yet his deepest desires and gentler inclinations, his love for music, crafts, companionship, perhaps even love itself, made him a stranger in his own court. In an era when kings were expected to be warriors, Edward's heart longed for peace, for loyalty, and maybe for something more tender, something forbidden. His deep attachment to Piers Gaveston, and later to Hugh Despenser, was seen not as love or friendship, but as weakness, scandal, and threat. Those closest to him betrayed him, the nobility turned on him, his own wife became the architect of his downfall, and when they finally came for him, they didn't just kill a king, they crafted a death so cruel, so painfully intimate, it would scar his memory for centuries. Whether or not the tale of the red-hot iron is fact or fiction, its existence says everything about the hatred that surrounded him. That his enemies wanted not only to end his life, but to desecrate it, to turn his alleged sins into the method of his execution. It's easy to call Edward a failed king, militarily weak, politically inept, but history is more than crowns and conquests. It's made of broken men, of misunderstood hearts, of people who didn't fit the mold they were born into. Edward II may have been a poor ruler, but perhaps he was also one of history's first victims of power, prejudice, and the merciless machinery of monarchy. His story isn't just about downfall, it's about how dangerous it can be to be different, to love wrongly in the eyes of power, to live gently in a brutal world. In the end, Edward's death wasn't only a punishment, it was a message. And centuries later, we're still listening. History often remembers kings for their victories, their conquests, their legacies cast in stone and blood. But Edward II is remembered for something far more tragic, not the kingdom he ruled, but the loneliness in which he died. Born a prince raised in the shadow of his warrior father, Edward was never meant to follow in such brutal footsteps. He was not a fighter, he was a dreamer, an artist of sorts, a man drawn to beauty, companionship, and quiet acts of humanity. But in a medieval world built on iron and war, gentleness was not just frowned upon, it was punished. His deep connection with men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, whether romantic or not, was enough to brand him as unfit, even perverse in the eyes of the nobility. His political missteps gave them all the excuse they needed. Betrayed by the very people who once pledged loyalty, including his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer Edward, was forced to abdicate, humiliated, and imprisoned. Yet his enemies didn't just want his crown, they wanted his soul broken, his body desecrated, his memory erased. What happened on the night of September 21st, 1327, remains one of the darkest enigmas in royal history. The most infamous version, that a red-hot iron was used to kill him through means so grotesque as to leave no visible mark, was more than execution. It was symbolic annihilation, a punishment tailored not for treason, but for who he was. Fact or legend, it reflects the cruelty of a world that feared and hated what it could not understand. Edward II's story is not just one of royal failure. It's a human tragedy of a man crushed between the crown he wore and the truth he lived. He reminds us that power without compassion turns men into monsters, that love, in any form, can become a weapon in the hands of the cruel. And most haunting of all, sometimes the loudest screams in history are the ones buried behind stone walls, silenced by politics, and muffled beneath centuries of shame. History is filled with betrayals, but few are as haunting as the slow, deliberate destruction of Edward II. A king betrayed not by enemies on a battlefield, but by those who once vowed love, loyalty, and protection. His fall wasn't marked by a single act of treason, but by a series of wounds inflicted by the people closest to him, the nobles he trusted, the wife he married, the very crown he was born to wear. Edward was no war hero. He was an unconventional ruler drawn more to people than to power, more to his passions than to politics. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, whether interpreted as friendship or forbidden love, made him a target for ridicule and rage. His favoritism toward Hugh Despenser only intensified the resentment. But it wasn't his politics that sealed his fate. It was the quiet, festering hatred in the heart of his queen. Isabella of France, once a child bride humiliated at her own wedding, returned as a woman forged by rejection and vengeance. Her love affair with Roger Mortimer wasn't just a scandal, it was a declaration of war against her husband. When she marched into England with a rebel army, she wasn't coming for reform. She came to erase him. After being forced to abdicate, Edward was stripped not only of power but of dignity. Imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, he became a ghost, tormented, humiliated, reduced to nothing. The night he died, a veil of secrecy descended. No royal funeral, no truth. Only rumors of a red-hot iron of screams muffled by pillows of a murder meant to leave no trace. It wasn't justice. It was revenge disguised as necessity. What makes Edward II's story unforgettable is not just the cruelty of his end, but the silence that followed. His death wasn't a tragic accident of war. It was a calculated act of political cleansing. The man who wore the English crown was buried under lies his memory sanitized for history. But behind the stone walls of Berkeley Castle, the truth still lingers. A man who loved in the wrong time, trusted the wrong people, and died the wrong way. Not because he failed as a king, but because he was human in a world that demanded monsters. There are deaths that make history, and then there are deaths that scar it. The final night of Edward II's life was not a quiet slipping into darkness, but a descent into a hell, crafted by human hands. In the cold silence of Berkeley Castle, cruelty became art. The man who was once England's king died not by sword or poison, but through a method so grotesque, so symbolically violent, that it echoes more like a medieval nightmare than a historical account. They say he screamed, but no one heard. They say pillows muffled his agony as red-hot iron seared his insides, delivered through a horn to leave no external scars. It was the perfect crime, brutal beyond imagination, yet clean on the outside. No blood, no wounds, just a contorted corpse and an official lie, natural causes. But no lie can contain that kind of suffering. This wasn't just an execution. It was a message to those who loved the wrong people, trusted the wrong favorites, ruled with the wrong heart. Edward's death was theater, the ultimate punishment for a king who didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a tyrant. He was flawed, emotional, loyal to a fault. He loved openly and perhaps unwisely, and in a world where power was maintained through cold calculation and brutality that made him dangerous. His murder wasn't justice, it was vengeance, cloaked in silence. There was no trial, no outcry, only whispers of horror passed through generations, turning into legend. Even today, the sheer inventiveness of his death chills the soul. It forces us to ask, how far will humans go to erase someone they hate? What kind of darkness lives in the hearts of those who orchestrate such pain and then bury it beneath stone and statecraft? Edward II's death was meant to be hidden, but it has become unforgettable. It stands as a brutal reminder that history is not only shaped by who wins, but by how far the victors will go to ensure their story is the only one left standing. And sometimes that story is written in fire screams, in silence. History often demands certainty, dates, names, causes. But when it comes to the death of Edward II, certainty dissolves into mist and myth stands where truth should be. The infamous tale of his murder, the red-hot iron. The horn, the muffled screams, is seared into our cultural memory. It shocks, repulses, and fascinates. But what if it never happened? What if the most gruesome death in medieval royal history was more legend than fact? The chilling details only appeared decades after Edward's demise. Before that, records were vague, polite, sanitized natural causes, they said. But time has a way of reshaping stories, and storytellers often favor drama over nuance. Could it be that the story of Edward's torture was less about what actually happened and more about what people wanted to believe had happened? In many ways, the tale serves a purpose. It punishes the unpopular king beyond the grave. It offers justice, however cruel, for his failures and scandals. It becomes poetic, a ruler accused of unkingly love, undone by unthinkable cruelty. In a world that condemned not just his politics but his heart, this death became a symbol, one that justified his downfall and fed the collective imagination of a betrayed realm. But history is rarely so clean. Rumors of Edward's survival surfaced soon after his supposed death. A letter claimed he was alive and hiding in Europe. Other accounts suggested a substitute corpse was buried in his place. And perhaps most revealing, even his enemies hesitated to confirm the story of the iron, as though it was too grotesque to admit or too fabricated to defend. So we are left with a question, not an answer. Did Edward die screaming in the dark? Or did he slip quietly into exile, forgotten by history's official pen? We may never know. But the uncertainty itself speaks volumes. It reminds us that history is not just a record of events, but a reflection of fear, hate, and hope. And in the case of Edward II, the truth may be more elusive and more human than the myth that replaced it. The death of Edward II stands not only as a historical question, but as a dark mirror reflecting the violence, politics, and prejudices of his time. Whether or not the tale of the red-hot iron is literally true, its survival across centuries speaks to something deeper, a need for justice, revenge, or perhaps a grotesque moral parable imposed on a man who defied expectations and paid the price. The story is so barbaric, so specific in its horror, that it feels almost theatrical. A king immobilized in the dead of night, a burning iron pushed through a horn into his body, destroying him from within without leaving a mark. It's punishment not just of the flesh, but of the soul, calculated to humiliate, to erase, to send a message. And that message was heard. For centuries, Edward II became the embodiment of failed kingship, unmasculine rule, and dangerous love. But this official narrative begins to crumble under scrutiny. The earliest and most trusted sources do not mention the iron. The graphic details appear later, not as testimony, but as myth. Who benefited from such a story? Queen Isabella, whose betrayal was softened by portraying her husband as monstrous Mortimer, who needed to justify regicide, or later chroniclers more interested in drama than truth. Still, even if apocryphal, the story persists because it resonates. In a society that condemned both political weakness and homosexuality, the nature of Edward's alleged death became the ultimate symbolic punishment. He was not just removed, he was desecrated in secret, in silence, in shame. And that silence echoes louder than screams. But history doesn't end with silence. The fact that we still ask what really happened, the fact that letters, records, and speculations survived, means Edward's story was never fully buried. Some say he escaped. Some say he was murdered quietly. Others still hold to the iron. But perhaps the real tragedy isn't how he died, it's how the world needed him to die, in fire and humiliation, to make sense of a king who didn't fit the mold. And so Edward II remains not just a monarch but a mystery, a man erased by myth, yet never truly forgotten. Edward II may have died in agony, but his story lived on in confusion, contradiction, and haunting ambiguity. For centuries, historians, playwrights, and storytellers have debated not just how he died, but what he truly was: a failed king, a misunderstood soul, a martyr to love in a world that had no place for it. What we know is this: Edward did not fit the mold of the king his people expected. He loved differently, he ruled unconventionally, and perhaps worst of all, he trusted with his heart, not with strategy. That cost him his allies, his wife, his crown, and ultimately, his life. Yet even in disgrace, Edward's story refused to fade into obscurity. It lingered not as a lesson in failure, but as a cautionary tale carved from cruelty and rumor. The image of a red-hot poker, still debated today, is less a historical fact than a metaphor, a grotesque symbol of how the medieval world dealt with those who strayed from its rigid codes of power, masculinity, and sexuality. Whether or not the torture actually occurred, the fact that it became the most accepted version of events speaks volumes. It reveals what people feared, what they condemned, and what they thought justice looked like when a king dared to rule outside the boundaries of tradition. And yet, even in death, Edward II could not be silenced. Whispers of survival surfaced letters, sightings even amongst journals suggesting he had lived on in exile. These rumors, however implausible, reflect a deeper yearning that perhaps the man crushed by his enemies, loved by history, might have escaped the fate so brutally written for him. Edward's legacy is not one of glory or conquest, but of humanity flawed, fragile, and tragically ahead of its time. He became a king remembered not for his victories, but for the pain of his downfall and the enigma of his final breath. In that way, Edward II endures not as a cautionary tale, but as a silent echo, a reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by those who suffer in the shadows and refuse to be forgotten.